My name's Sian Griffiths. I'm the education lead for the ACE Hub Wales, and we produced this film today to give you some guidance when you're delivering the training yourself for your school to become an ACE aware school. So the aim of today's workshop is to give you a basic education on what the impact of toxic stress is on the brain of both children, which then obviously carries on impacting onto adults. It's to raise awareness of adverse childhood experiences and the impact of trauma on our young people that we work with every day, and to give you an update regarding the early intervention project. The early intervention project I was involved with in Bridgend was a 2-year project which basically was facilitated by a number of different providers from Barnardo's, NSPCC and South Wales Police. And we worked on a pilot project in the Bridgend 3 primary schools in the Maesteg cluster, and we were striving to have early intervention as a priority so that we could ensure that the families had suitable support before it reached the crisis level. So we were trying to get in there as early as possible to make sure that that early help was available in the particular areas that we were working in. When we start with this particular slide, which is the introduction, we're going to be asking you to, in the audience, to name and roll a favourite TV programme that you used to watch as a child. When we do this particular activity, the aim is to give the staff a couple of minutes to discuss with their partners or on their tables if they can remember back to a particular childhood memory that they had of a TV programme that they really used to enjoy watching. The aim of this particular slide is for them to understand that when we ask people to go back to their childhood memories, it can be for some children who've experienced toxic stress and trauma, incredibly painful experience. But we just hope that most people would be able to think back at their childhood and be able to have memories of happy places that they used to go. But we have to be mindful of the fact that for some people and adults as well, is that some people's backgrounds have not been as happy experiences as we'd like them to be. And we need to remember to keep ourselves safe when we deliver in this particular activity, because it can take people back to some painful experiences. And if you feel, or anybody in the room at this point feels that they would like to take a breath of fresh air or have a drink of water, that's absolutely fine, because what we don't want is anyone to feel uncomfortable with what we are sharing. And we do appreciate that at this point in the exercise that can be the case for some people depending on their backgrounds. And we need to be mindful of the support that's available in your particular school for traumatic incidences that that might be triggered in yourself when children actually share things that have gone on in their lives. So we ask ourselves on the next slide, why are we here today? Obviously, the reason why we're here today stems from the 2-year Bridgend pilot project, which was aiming for breaking the generational cycle of crime. There's a brand new Successful Futures new curriculum which is going to be rolled out over the next 4 years, and at this point in this particular slide you need to be stressing the importance of health and well-being now becoming 1/6 of the curriculum time, which is a really beneficial step forward for Wales as a country, so that children's mental health and well-being is actually being prioritised and given the same amount of curriculum time as literacy and numeracy. So instead of it being a bolt-on with a PSE lesson at the end of the week, if you've got time, it's now going to be really embedded in the curriculum, and children are actually going to be learning about their brain development, learning about why they behave in certain ways, to give them some understanding and to feel that maybe they're not to blame for some of the experiences that they have in the school day, which makes them feel stressed and probably makes them sort of feel out of control on certain days. There's the Keeping Learners Safe document in 2015, and this document is actually about the fact that you need to stress that this is everybody's business to keep children and learners safe. It's not just the pastoral team or the SMT team or the safeguarding team. It really is everybody's business. If you're face-to-face with a child on a day-to-day basis, that it's your job to listen to that child and to take their concerns seriously, and to make sure that you follow the procedures and guidelines that will be in place in your school to protect those children. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act has 7 main aims, and that was obviously produced in 2015 for people to ensure that Wales are healthier, and we strive to be a healthier, happier, more positive place to live. On the equality and equity slide, when this flashes up, what you need to explain is that in the past there's been a constant drive for people to have equality, and what we've now realised is that our children don't come into school on an equal basis. They come from very different backgrounds. Some of them have had lovely nurturing upbringing with all the experiences that we would want for our young children. They've had nursery rhymes read to them, stories read to them, started to learn their numbers, and they've been toilet trained and started to have conversations with their adults that look after them, and this has enabled them to have a really good starting point before they even arrive at the school doors. But as we know, a majority of children in certain areas don't have the experiences that we would wish for them to have, and obviously what we're going to strive for is equity in our schools, that we give the scaffolding for those children to have the same opportunities, so that even though they haven't come in at a certain starting point as everybody else, that we provide the scaffolding to enable them to get to the same point as everybody else and to have the same opportunities. We bring up the photograph, the vision of walking in a really wooded area next, where the birds are in the trees and everything's feeling quite relaxed. You're walking your dog and you're enjoying hearing the sounds around you, and all of a sudden there is a button on the this particular slide which you then press, which shows which you can hear the sound of a bear. Now, obviously, at this point, we want to stress that we don't usually come across bears in the countryside, but it's just to show that your body and your mind starts to change when we have a scary experience, or we feel that there is danger around a corner. And at this point, you bring up the next slide, which then shows the bear, and you press the button again, which actually makes the sound quite loud of a bear roaring. You can give them some suggestions of sweaty palms, feeling as if their heart is beating really loudly, and the fact that they would really want to actually run and get themselves to some sort of safe position out of the way. So you start to talk about the experiences of the body changing when we start to be feeling unsafe in the environment in which we live in. The impact of stress slide, you need to read out the information that's in each box. In the green box for positive stress and tolerable stress in the orange box, and then you need to give a short description of the toxic stress information in that particular box, and then you need to give some examples of the three particular boxes and the types of experiences that might occur within each category of those boxes. There are three sort of elements of stress that we talk about when we're looking at adverse childhood experiences. And there is positive stress, sort of tolerable stress and toxic stress. And they are in certain colours, which are green for positive, amber for tolerable stress, and red for toxic stress. And usually when we see a red, sort of anything with the colour red, it usually is sort of gives you the element of danger, and that really is the case when we think about toxic stress in the children that we work with. Tolerable stress would be your orange box, which would be more severe stress response, which is limited in time, but it does allow for recovery. So when you talk about the middle section, you would be talking about stressful experiences such as maybe a separation or a divorce in the family. It could be somebody's been diagnosed with serious illness. It could be somebody's lost their job or had a redundancy, and for a period that would be extremely stressful. But in time, things do start to improve, and hopefully the body starts to get a little bit more relieved when things start to sort of work themselves out. The green positive stress box, which is the one that you start with, is your basic everyday type of stresses where you have 50 emails coming in, you've got telephone calls, people wanting you to complete targets for your job. And basically those are positive because we all need a certain level of positive stress to enable us to achieve our ambitions. For example, a driving test or pass your GCSEs. But obviously, as the periods of stress start to take their toll on the body, if you are living in a toxic stress environment, which is the red box, then that would be a constant period of living in an environment where there is extreme stress, such as, for example, a domestic violence situation in the household, where the child is never really sure whether it's going to explode again and whether things are going to increase. And it can be a very dangerous situation in which to live in. And because it is extreme and it carries on for very long periods, we need to stress at this point that children's brains, we now know, start to alter in response to the environment in which they're living in. So toxic stress is obviously there for children in very stressful situations where the household has either increased alcohol use or there are lots of drugs use going on in the property, and these children get used to living in that environment. But as time goes on, the actual adults that are meant to be supporting them are really not available to them in the way that we would want. So, for example, in a domestic violence situation, if mum is very concerned about when the next issue or the next attack is going to happen, she is not really going to be thinking about supporting the child in the way that we would like, through no fault of her own, because she's obviously trying to keep her head above water and obviously trying to protect everybody in the family from the situation that's going on. So the child starts to learn to almost stand on their own 2 feet and not to get involved with adults because they don't trust adults, because they can be unsafe. And what happens is without that buffering of a supported adult, that toxic stress really starts to have a major impact on the way that the brain starts to develop and change. The type of stress that we're looking at with adverse childhood experiences is the third one, which is toxic stress. And that's the one that we're going to be focusing on today. And that was the one that we just experienced when we pretended that the bear was coming out of the woods, when our body started to change in response to the situation. That is extreme stress, it's frequent, and it's extended activation of the body's stress response. And this is the important bit, without the buffering of a supported adult. So this is intense stress. It is basically living in a toxic stress environment every day, because if you're living in a domestic violence abuse situation, you don't know when it's going to happen. If you're living with parents or one parent or both that are indulging in alcohol, obviously to extreme levels, or drug abuse, then that is going to be carrying on. And it doesn't just happen for a couple of weeks. It can be happening for years and years within our households of our young children. That is part of what they are living with on a daily basis. Trauma and brain development. This you link back to the exercise that we did a couple of slides before, where you took them through a walk in the countryside and suddenly the body's response started to change because there was an unsafe situation and you heard the sound of the bear in the background. And you describe this particular box with being at rest when you were walking obviously through the countryside with the birds and the trees and with your dog. And then the red box shows that the threat starts because you heard the sound of something quite out of the ordinary in the distance, and that gets your body's response ready to start to think that there is something unusual happening. The chemicals that flood in are adrenaline and cortisol in small amounts is quite useful because it helps to keep us safe. It helps us to fight, flight and freeze to get out of very dangerous situations. But in large amounts, cortisol can be absolutely toxic, and it can be an extremely dangerous chemical to have running through your body on a regular basis. The toxic stress levels are going to increase, and your body flips straight into a response to that, which is the fight, flight or freeze, which we call the 3 Fs at this point. And obviously the body starts to do 3 things to keep itself safe when it's under threat. It will either try to fight, it will either try to flight, to run away, or to freeze. And those 3 responses are things that we see in the children in our classrooms very regularly if they've experienced a toxic stress environment at home. So at this point, you need to stress that this adrenaline and cortisol rushes in, and the children have no really control over what their body is actually telling them to do. It really is an automatic response that the body has to keep themselves safe, and they have to do one of 3 things. This trauma that they've experienced, and if they're living in a trauma type of environment with regular experiences of traumatic events going on, the brain becomes fixed in something called an allostatic load, which basically means the body is constantly telling them to keep safe, even if they are in a safe environment, such as the school situation. But it can be something as simple as a voice or tone of voice, or the way somebody looks at them that suddenly takes them back to feeling a threat. and the body goes straight back into the fight, flight and freeze mode that it's used to being in. And sadly, what we find is that the brain, we now know, gets fixed after so long. At the end of the slide on trauma and brain development, there is a short film which comes from the resilience screenings that we show quite regularly, and it basically shows what that looks like for a child on a daily basis. And it's a short clip which shows a child crossing the road with a number of lorries and vehicles coming at them from all directions, and how their brain actually tells them to fight, to flight or to freeze to keep themselves safe. And it ends with the child being in the classroom in quite a safe situation, but feeling the constant lorry coming at them from every direction, causing them to want to be always on, ready to respond in the way that their body has just become so used to, that it's become a habit, so that they will fight, flight or freeze at any point of the school day. The critical years make a huge difference. We know that in the first 2 years of a baby's life, the brain is growing from 25% to 80% of its size. This is when all those vital pathways are being joined together, connections are being made, and we know that these pathways develop in a really positive way if the adult is there for that child and they have a really good reciprocal relationship, which we sometimes call serve and return, so that the child knows that their needs are going to be met. For example, if they cry, that they're going to be lifted from the cot, they're either going to be soothed, or their nappy's going to be changed, or they're going to have their bottle. Somebody's going to look after them when they're feeling upset and tired, and this is where the baby learns that the adult is there to be trusted. If this isn't going on in the way that we would like it to be happening in certain environments, because the adult is under a lot of toxic stress and lots of trauma is going on, we know that this can be interfered with, and certain other types of attachment styles start to be developed, which are not secure attachment. They can be a resistant type of attachment where they just cry louder and louder to get their needs met, and they start to use behaviours that are maybe a little bit more unhelpful, and they start to misbehave in a certain way to get the attention that they very often crave. And sometimes we can have something called disorganised attachment style, which is a mixture of all the most unhelpful ones all put together, which can be incredibly hard to sort of manage within the classroom situation when they start school later on. We know that the critical years make a difference. If anybody's done attachment work, you know that the first 2 years is when a baby is making secure attachments with a parent, an adult. There's a reciprocal relationship between the baby, cries, and an adult will come and look after me. They will either feed me, change my nappy, or they will rock me, or they will soothe me. And that is a secure attachment with an adult. But if that adult isn't available because there is a lot of toxic stress in the environment, then that baby can often be crying for long periods and their needs are not being attended to, which is where we have certain attachment styles that come in which are not secure attachments because the adult hasn't been there for them. So in the first 2 years, children's brains are growing from 25% to 80% of the adult size. That is when all the pathways are joining together, when the brain is making connections. This is also, most interestingly, I think, this is what is happening where the child, even at that first 2 years, is starting to learn empathy for others. Starting to learn that if I hurt somebody, they might cry, or if somebody hurts me, I might cry. It's the very early stages of somebody actually learning to be empathetic. And that is when the child also learns to trust that the adult is going to meet their needs. When I cry in the pram or the cot, somebody will come to me. Obviously, we know in the cases of neglect that we have babies in cots that can be crying for hours and the adult is not available for them, that they are not having a nappy change, that they are not being soothed, and then that starts to cause really big problems. So that trust is then lost because the adult is not a trustworthy person that's going to come to them. And obviously they start then to lose trust later on in life in the whole community around them. Why should anybody trust a community when their own parent hasn't given them what they needed? How on earth are they going to trust an adult that they don't actually know? The next slide will then go on, you press play on this one and it takes you straight to a link for YouTube, which is all about brain builders and how we build healthy brains in our young children. So you play the video, it lasts for a couple of minutes long, and basically at the end of the video, you just talk about was there any points that you found relevant and anything that you found was helpful on the video when you're thinking about the classroom day-to-day environment and the way the children actually present within the classroom structure. Experiences that occur during childhood that directly harm a child, for example, sexual or physical abuse, or they affect the environment in which they live, for example, growing up in a house with domestic violence. This is from Professor Bellis, who works for Public Health, who's done some research which we're going to talk about in a moment, and this was from 2016. The next slide looks at the actual Welsh study from 2 years ago by Professor Bellis, and it looked at do adverse childhood experiences have a huge impact on the way that the way you live your life as an adult, and the effect of what's happened to you as a child being linked to certain behaviours that you might be experiencing as an adult. The first research that Bellis looked into, which you need to describe, is he looked at if you've had adverse childhood experiences of 4 or more, did this increase your likelihood of indulging in self-harming behaviours in later life? So you need to describe the self-harming behaviours would be things like increased use of alcohol, it could be increased use of drug taking, it could be cannabis use, it could also be a form of abuse to your body by either overeating or undereating, and those self-harming behaviours would be what you would talk about in that first particular research that Bellis produced. The second piece of research that you then talk about on this particular slide is about the impact of adverse childhood experiences on people's mental health and well-being as an adult. And there's no surprise to say at this point is that there's not a day goes by in the media at the moment where we have got a huge crisis in public health across Wales and across the whole of the UK, with both children and adults with tremendous mental health issues. And obviously we now know that this research is totally linked to their adverse childhood experiences. The third piece of information that you need to describe is about the link between chronic illness and disease in later on life, also with a high incidence of adverse childhood experiences. And you can talk about the fact that there's going to be an increase, we know, for people with 4 ACEs or more, of a higher incidence of heart disease, pulmonary disease, diabetes type 2, and it's almost, you can describe that it's almost like when the immune system is low, you're far more susceptible to certain illnesses, and it's a bit like the huge increases of cortisol that have run through your body with toxic stress almost makes your body run down and obviously starts to break down, and you're far more likely to develop some of the chronic illnesses that we see at the moment increasing within society. The fourth piece of research that comes up in this particular slide is a more recent piece of research by Bellis, and he was interested in finding out whether, if you've had obviously a poor mental health, how did you go about looking at improving your resilience in order to be able to deal with that on a day-to-day basis? So he started to look at the links between what makes you more resilient. So you need to stress at this point that we're not born with resilience. We learn resilience as time goes on through a varied different methods and ways. But the main thing to stress at this point is to say that the outcome of this particular research looks at the fact of a supportive adult being there for you can really make the difference with developing resilience as an adult for later life. So that, in the case of children, could well be a teacher that they've got a really good close bond with and a relationship with. So you need to stress that the main elements of the resilience that has come out in this particular research is the adult supportive relationship. It also looks at the increased resilience through sport and being involved in some team games, that really helps children's resilience to build, because they feel their self-esteem is raised by being part of a team sport like football or rugby or netball, and they tend to obviously feel better about themselves. And we know that the effects of physical exercise certainly improves mental well-being as well, with the happy chemicals like serotonin that are released when we do physical activity. And you also need to talk about the fact that people develop resilience if they feel better community links as well. So if they feel part of the community in which they live in, they are far more likely to develop some resilience skills. So if they feel that there are people out there to support them, whether that's sort of community type groups, whether it's just a coffee morning or something that they actually attend in the local community, can have a great help for them in developing resilience in later on in life. The next slide, you start to look at and introduce the audience to the results that Bellis has found in his Welsh study from 2 years ago on adverse childhood experiences in Wales. He looked at how many adults in Wales have been exposed to each ACE, and you describe very carefully the 9 ACEs that we talk about when we look at adverse childhood experiences. So the 3 main ones that we look at with child maltreatment are verbal abuse and physical abuse and sexual abuse. When you look at these particular slides, you need to be stressing the verbal abuse would be the constant messages that some children get from their parent or their caregiver about the fact that they are a waste of space, they're useless, they can't do anything. It's just the constant put downs of making them feel exactly like you're exactly like your dad. Just constantly verbal abuse can have a really negative impact on children. If they're hearing that message, they start to believe it. You need to stress that at that point. Physical abuse obviously would be being injured by an adult that looks after you, and obviously sexual abuse then would be an adult indulging in sexual activity with a minor under the age, obviously, of consent. The parental separation and domestic violence, mental illness, alcohol abuse, drug use and incarceration make up the other ACEs, and they are usually to do with the environment or the child's household in which they live in. And at this point, it might be interesting to ask the question as to whether those percentages would be reflective of the area in which you're working in, because in some of the areas, in more deprived areas with lots of social issues, the fact that drug use only comes up in the survey of 5% would seem quite low in comparison to maybe what you're experiencing in sort of certain schools in certain areas around Wales. The reason for this that you need to stress at this point is the survey was conducted in adults from the age of 18 to 69. And obviously, when we look back at people's childhood and you're interviewing people from the ages of sort of 50 to 69, if you look back at their childhood, their parents would have been far less likely to have been indulging in sort of the drugs use that we see going on in society in today. So obviously, the adults in the survey, the older adults that were in the survey, obviously didn't have that as much of an issue as maybe that if we look back at this survey and go back and revisit it in 20 years from now, I'm sure that the 5% will be incredibly increased, and that obviously we're seeing that in in what we see in the schools all the time, is that there's an incredible high level of children where cannabis use in the household and drug taking has become quite the norm of what of the environment in which they live in. So the statistics are quite low in that particular category because of the age of the people in the survey, which maybe needs some description, I suppose, to explain as to why they maybe feel that that statistic is quite low. And also the other thing to stress in this particular box is people get very worried about the parental separation. We know that 1 in 2 families or marriages actually breaks down, and what we don't want is to make people feel really guilty and feel really upset that if they have experienced or are in the middle of a separation or a divorce at this point, is that they're going to put they've given their child an ACE. Because what we're more concerned about is the way that the breakup has been handled rather than the actual separation itself. Separation for some children can be a positive experience, especially if there's been a tremendous amount amount of domestic violence going on. It can be an actual relief when the parents do eventually, hopefully, separate because they've realised that maybe their relationship isn't having the positive effect on the children that it should have. So the 20% that was reflected in this particular survey, again, is quite low, because if we think of 1 in 2 marriages breaking down, 20% is obviously 1 in 5. But obviously what we're looking at with this particular adverse childhood experience is the type of break-up that you experience. If it was extremely negative and it went on for long periods and it was quite abusive and the children were sort of caught up in the middle of it all, then that could have a major, tremendous effect on the children, but not always. Some parental separation and divorce children actually handle quite well, depending on how their parents have handled it. Poverty means that the children have less resilience in order to overcome adversity. So poverty isn't one. But obviously what we found is that it impacts greatly, because the poverty as another sort of side that goes in also increases risks as well. The Welsh ACE study looks at the prevalence. So when you bring up this particular slide, you need to be reading from the information that's in the box that says for every 100 adults in Wales, 47 have suffered at least one ACE during their childhood, and 14 have suffered 4 or more. It's important at this point to emphasise that ACEs are not a small sort of category or group of people that we put into one sort of area when we work in, especially in the school structure, because ACEs are all of us. We all experience, sadly, at least half the population experiences at least one ACE or more. So it's people like myself and other people in the room that have experienced ACEs. It's not just sort of a category that we put people into and say, oh, they are sort of in the ACE category, because it is just basic life, basically, of ups and downs that people experience and traumas that sadly we all have to go through at certain periods in our life. Then you read from the box that obviously in the particular survey that was carried out, 53% didn't have any ACEs at all when they looked back at their childhood. And then we start to look at the increased percentages of 1 ACE, 20%, 2 to 3 ACEs, 13%, and 4+ ACEs would have been 14% of the 100 adults in Wales that were surveyed. And that category is the one that causes us the most problems, because if you've had 4 ACEs or more, that we now know leads to incredible risks of self-harming behaviours, an increased risk of poor and low mental health and well-being, and also a huge increase in the risk of you having a chronic disease in later life. So if we're looking at categories of 4 or more ACEs, the chances of you having those increased risks really do dramatically start to rise, which is something that you need to be stressing at this point. The first box that you describe about the increased risk links to the first Bellis study, which looks at the link between 4 or more ACEs and the increased self-harming behaviours that adults indulge in later on in life. And you read through and pick out a couple of these categories, probably the ones that are the most shocking. So you describe 2 children in your class, one who hasn't got any ACEs at all, and maybe the child next door who has got 4 or more ACEs going on, and you look at the increased risks for the child with the 4+ ACEs, and you start to read out some of the categories that he is 20 times more likely than his friend to end up in prison, and he's 16 times more likely to have used crack cocaine or heroin. And I usually read out the one that is 11 times more likely to smoke cannabis, to actually, later on in life, to feel a sense of calm and to almost take away some of the worries and concerns that they seem to have. The next category looks at the second piece of research by Bellis, which looks at the links between 4 or more ACEs, again, with increased problems with mental health and well-being later on in life for adults. And you read out from this the information that over the past 2 weeks, compared to people with no ACEs, those with 4+ ACEs are 6 times more likely to have never or rarely felt useful, which is really quite a sad statistic to think that if you've had 4 or more ACEs as a child, you then go on to be 6 times more likely as an adult to feel that you're of no use, you play no part in society, and nobody feels that you're benefiting by being and existing basically in the world that you're in. So I always use that statistic because I think that one really is gives us an idea about what people start to feel like later on in life if they have experienced trauma in their childhood. It's also good to maybe read out about the fact that they're 5 times more likely to have never or rarely made up their mind about things, and 5 times more likely to have never dealt with their problems well. So these can be can often be the parents that we find the most difficult to engage with us in a school structure, because they really cannot see the wood from the trees, because they cannot deal with their problems in a sort of a clear sort of way in which we would like to think that we'd be able to, because everything is a bit like they're stuck in a fog. They can't see the way out of the situation that they're in, so they tend to bury their head in the sand very often and tend to ignore problems, thinking that they're going to go away, because they just have not got the capabilities to be able to positively deal with them. And obviously we need to be mindful when we work with our families that if these experiences are what they're going through, is that they're very unlikely to want to engage with us on a day-to-day basis, and we have to find ways in which we can make them feel more comfortable and secure in coming back into the school environment to seek help if they feel that they're at that point of needing it. The third slide links to Bellis's work on the link between ACEs and chronic disease. And what you need to do when you actually look at this particular slide is to read out the information that up to the age of 69 years, those with 4 or more ACEs are twice more likely than those without ACEs to be diagnosed with a chronic disease. And you can read out some of the quite shocking statistics: 4 times more likely to develop diabetes type 2, 3 times more likely to develop heart disease, and 3 times more likely to develop respiratory disease. So if you can take it back again to real life situations and 2 children in your class and compare 2 children and about the child who's got 4 ACEs, what his chances are going to be to develop one of these illnesses in later on in life, it really does help you to clarify the chances that 2 children have got within the same classroom structure, but what might happen to the one in later on in life. And you can read over the fact that they're obviously far more likely to take themselves to the GP, they're far more likely to end up in hospital, and they're far more likely to have to stay in hospital overnight, because obviously all the problems that they have with their medical side of things obviously puts extra strain on the NHS, and that's what we see on a day-to-day basis. After you've described the 3 pieces of work by Professor Bellis about the research that he's produced, the next slide is going to show you the ACE animation. So there is a button at the bottom which you are going to press, and the ACE animation is around about 5 minutes in length, and it looks at a Welsh families from a sort of valleys area, and it looks at how the intergenerational cycle carries on in certain families where the behaviours tend to carry on down the generations. So once you've played the animation, you can ask the audience if there are families that you work with that maybe some of the things that you saw in the video would be what they would be experiencing, and it might sort of jog your memory to think about the types of families that have difficulties in this particular area. After the ACE animation, there's going to be time for a 10 to 15 minute break, depending on how quickly you want to move on to the second half of the presentation. You begin the second session by another short activity where you get the audience to close their eyes and imagine that they are at the bottom of the mountain. So they look at the slide for a couple of minutes, which shows an adult at the top of the mountain, and you ask them to put themselves in the position of being at the bottom of the mountain, looking up at the adult or the caregiver at the top of the mountain. And what happens is you would be reaching out for help or support from that adult, but what the adult is actually doing in this particular scenario is starts to throw small stones down at you, which then start to increase in size until you feel that you have to protect yourself because the adult is harming you in some way. And we ask the audience at this point to close their eyes and imagine what it would feel like for a child on a day-to-day basis, where the caregiver, who's meant to be the person looking after them and caring for them is actually the person that's causing them maybe the most harm. And as those small stones get larger and the rocks and the pebbles get bigger, and that's happening on a very regular basis, how the child can start to feel incredibly let down by all the people around them that should be the main caregivers. What I'm trying to put you into the place of is how it feels for some of our young children when the person that's meant to be caring for them is actually the ones that sometimes is causing them maybe the most harm. Behaviour is communication. This slide is really important because it starts to lead you into thinking about the children that are experiencing traumatic events at home or living in the toxic stress environment, what they actually present like on a day-to-day basis in the classroom. And we know the children who experience trauma find it incredibly difficult to be able to communicate their emotions. So there would be certain triggers that you need to express at this point, and those triggers can be something as simple as somebody wearing a perfume or a hairspray, or that smell in the way that maybe an adult has smelt in the past that's maybe been abusive to them. It could be a trigger of somebody raising their voice or shouting or screaming that takes them back to that traumatic event that they've experienced. It could be something as simple as somebody just glancing at them in the wrong direction and making them feel threatened. These triggers are there, and we often in the school situation and the classroom as a teacher can't even see what the triggers are. But what we actually see is the behaviour that is communicated by the child when those triggers are set off within the brain structure. And life for that child can be incredibly difficult. They can spend their day constantly with rushes of cortisol running through their body that we discussed in the previous slides. This extra adrenaline that they constantly having through their bloodstream, obviously it is starting to make them feel that they're under threat even when they're not. So even in a safe situation, in a secure classroom environment, that you feel, well, why are they behaving in this way? Because they are safe and they are secure here. There are certain triggers going on from things that they've experienced that we can't even begin to imagine. And we need to start asking the question at this point to our children of, instead of, well, what's wrong with you today? To start to rephrase our communication and start to be thinking about, well, what's happened to you? Because we know at this point that if they are fight, flighting or freezing, that is a clear signal for us without even knowing what is going on, that there is something happening that causes their body to feel unsafe. And that is what they display in the classroom situation. We get shaken up when we experience trauma, and obviously how do we relieve the pressure safely? So when we work with trauma, which is the next slide, there's a Coca-Cola picture bottle. And what we do with this is you can either actually use the Coca-Cola bottle and you can shake it up, or you can just talk about the picture itself and say, imagine a Coca-Cola bottle that's shook up enough if you're traveling around and it's in your bag. And if you wanted to obviously have a drink, you wouldn't, after knowing it's been shook up, release the cap of the bottle because obviously the Coca-Cola would fizz out and would spill over everything and would just jet up into your face. So what you look at is, you look at the picture of the Coca-Cola bottle and you actually look at that with a child's stressful experiences of being shaken up on a day-to-day basis with certain experiences that have happened to them. And what we try to do when we talk about children with trauma that have been completely shaken up is you have to release the pressure valve very, very slowly. You can't have long conversations with children that have experienced trauma and expect them to tell you all what's happening in one go. So we use the Coca-Cola bottle, and if you're physically using the Coca-Cola bottle, you show that you would be turning the cap very, very slowly to release the pressure, because you don't want the child to have to release the pressure and go straight back into the fight, flight and freeze mode, which tells them that they have to keep themselves safe because they feel threatened. So it's a gradual release of the Coca-Cola bottle that's been shook up to keep the child feeling calm and safe and feeling secure. There's a picture that you can describe, which is a picture of the brain, which looks at the fact that the brain is split into three main parts, which is the reptilian part, which is the survival part that we've spoken about previously, which causes the child to go into the fight, flight and freeze response when they feel threatened. The mammalian part of the brain is the next part, which is about their feelings, which they find incredibly hard to express when they are living in toxic stress environments or experience trauma. And then the thinking part of the brain is the top part of the brain that enables them to think about what's happened. And what we find, which is good to express at this point, is to use the fist size of the brain to actually show that the bottom bit of the brain is the bit that causes the response of the fight, flight and freeze. And then obviously if we think about the middle part of the brain, which is the feelings part, and then the top part, which is the thinking part. And what happens to children in the toxic stress environment, or when they've experienced lots of trauma, is that basically what happens is we use the terminology, they can flip their lid. So if you actually show your fist doing this, it shows that when they're in this part of the brain is the part that's in control, which is the fight, flight and freeze, is that the thinking part, which is the top part of the brain, is not able to be accessed whatsoever. So there is no point having conversations with children when they are in the fight, flight and freeze mode, when they have come out of the safety zone, because they're in an arousal state, which means that this part of the brain isn't going to be able to be accessed until a lot later when they actually calm back down. And when the brain starts to fold back over, they can start to think about the response of what they've experienced and what has happened to them. After you've described the brain in a simplified fashion with your fist, you can press on the YouTube link, which takes you to Dan Siegel, who actually describes what the working part of the brain looks like and the controls and responses that we use on when we're working with trauma. There is no point trying to have a conversation with them then. All the thinking part of the top part of the brain is then basically, they're unable to access it anyway. So often in schools, we try to have conversations with children about, why did you do it? They stand there going, I don't know why I did it. Got no reason, I don't know why I did. They cannot think why they did it. That thinking part of the brain, when they do this and they are flipping their lid and the fight, flighting and freezing comes in, the thinking part of the brain is not operating anyway. So obviously those conversations, which we do have to have with our children to try to repair some of the damage, has to be done when they come back to a certain state of calm. The next slide it looks at a case study from an actual family. So obviously the names have been changed for confidentiality purposes. When I do this slide, I ask them in groups to read and discuss the case study. The case study takes you through the scenarios of a girl called Sian, and it basically, it was some life story work that was completed to help Sian. Sian is now an adult, but they took her through a process to take her back to her life, to look at the adverse childhood experiences that she had gone through, to actually help to try to support her as an adult. And Sian then goes on in these case studies. It takes you from the first part of her life when she's a small child herself and her parents' situation. And then it takes you on to actually Sian's experiences as a teenager, and then Sian's experiences as an adult, and how then she starts, the same cycle starts to continue because she has a small child called Matt. And obviously Matt starts to have some of these same experiences that Sian has as a child. So when you look at this particular case study, you give the handouts and you ask them to work in a small group of a maximum of 5 to 6 in the room, and you get them to work through. So you could give them highlighting pens at this point, and what you're asking them to do is to identify the ACEs that Sian and Matt have experienced and how this is probably going to impact on Matt in his later on life. You then start to discuss the second point, which is what school staff will have contact with Matt and how they can support him when he enters the school situation and environment. What would Matt need in an educational setting to reduce his triggers or further trauma as he goes through the school structure? What behaviour is Matt likely to display in school, and would this potentially change as he becomes older? And you end with how has Sian's trauma affected your ability to support Matt's education, and what strategies could be used to overcome this? It would be helpful at this point to have each group to share back on each point to keep the timing guidelines of this particular session. So if they're in 5 or 6 tables, then they can all feed back on one particular point rather than trying to feed back on all of those particular messages. On the case study for Sian and Matt, this is a good point to reflect back and see if your audience can remember what the ACEs were from the period before the break. So it'll jog their memory before they start the next activity in their groups. So we've looked at in our groups, hopefully they've been able to identify the ACEs in Sian's life. And at this point, you will bring up all the ACEs that have been identified, and you would have a short discussion as to whether they were accurate in their findings. Were they able to correctly identify how many ACEs Sian was experiencing? And you would run through the fact that she's actually experienced mental health, sexual abuse, drug use, domestic violence, alcohol abuse, verbal abuse and parental separation. So she really has got a huge amount of ACEs which she's experienced, and you start to talk about the effect that that might have had on her, which we now starting to see in her behaviours as an adult. On the next slide, you would then recap with the group. Did they identify correctly whether Matt had a number of ACEs? And you would start to bring up the ACEs that Matt has experienced, which are parental separation. He's already experienced domestic violence, drug use, parents in prison, and mental health. And you would start to talk about the fact that even just at the age of 3, he has already got 5 ACEs. The iceberg slide is one that we show in schools. It's often shown for some attachment behaviours that we recognise as well. And the main point of this slide is to say that obviously while what we see goes on at the top of the iceberg, we have to be delving underneath the iceberg to see what is actually going on and what those behaviours could be communicating for us in the school structure. So on the top of the iceberg, what you would be seeing in the school classroom structure would be children that would be tired in school because maybe they haven't got to bed on time. They would be withdrawn. They can become very quiet children that don't engage and don't seem to want to take part in anything. They can often have difficulty forming friendships, hypervigilant, which means they're constantly on alert and watching to see what might happen next, because sometimes their environments have been very haphazard and they can be sort of quite explosive on certain times. So they can be hypervigilant to see what maybe might be coming next. They can have loss of appetite or overeating that we see in the school's day. We see children controlling their diet, especially with teenagers. They can be overeating to comfort themselves, but they can also be undereating because that's a form of control. Children that start to feel that their whole lives are out of control will start to look at other ways that they can control. And sometimes that control can also be part of what they try to do in the classroom as well. They can try and control their friendships with their peer groups. They can try and control what's going on with the teacher relationship. They can start to feel that they're not going to be completing homework because that can be, in a way, a form of power and control, that they're going to refuse to do what's asked of them. But then underneath the iceberg, you would start then to look at all the scenarios that were going on in Sian and Matt's life. And obviously, underneath the iceberg in Sian's life, those behaviours could have been what she was actually showing in the school, which is why she ended up being excluded from school as a teenager. But underneath the iceberg, Sian was experiencing she'd witnessed the arrest of a father. She had parental separation. She had the parents' offending behaviours going on. She had tremendous mental health difficulties that she'd observed going on with her mum. She'd had neglect, obviously, physical abuse and verbal abuse, and she was constantly witnessing domestic violence. So what's going on underneath the iceberg is the important bit, not what we are seeing, because what we are seeing is just the behaviours, but they are communicating to us is that she was a very scared individual who was living in a very unsafe environment. Domestic violence is a huge issue, certainly in particularly Bridgend and the Valleys areas. There are more call-outs and public protection notices for domestic violence. They are really massively on the increase that our young people are facing all the time. Parents' offending behaviours, parental separation, mothers' mental health difficulties, neglect and physical abuse. All that's going on underneath the surface, and what we are just seeing is what's going on the top of the iceberg. We then show the slide of trauma and the effects of trauma, and these will come up as you press the clicker one at a time. And obviously we now know that the effects of children that have experienced tremendous trauma and lived in toxic stress environments, they become very anxious. This can lead to anxiety attacks. It can lead to incredible feelings of stress just in the normal classroom situation and environment. They obviously tend to be quite poor learners. They have trouble with concentrating, and their attention span can be extremely low. So you need to describe that. They can usually be impulsive learners as well. They can take risks, these children, that you wouldn't normally expect children to take. They can be very impulsive. They tend to do things without thinking about the consequences, and we see that happening very regularly. Again, we've described hypervigilance, which is where they're constantly on alert. They can't relax. Their bodies don't feel that they can breathe. They almost feel constantly stressed and constantly looking around for things that might be happening. They have incredible difficulty building relationships, not just with adults, but also with children as well, because they've been constantly let down. If the adult that you hopefully trust every day to look after you isn't there for you, very soon you learn that trusted adult, if that person isn't there for you, how on earth would you go and trust an adult that you don't know very well? So they do tend to have real trouble with adult and child relationships, which can mean that the parents and the teacher finds it very difficult to engage with the child. They become disengaged on a daily basis. They start to opt out of lessons. They don't want to be involved because the concentration span is low and attention span, and their brains are having to cope with so many other things and memories that are going on, is that they become incredibly disengaged from the structure of the classroom. What we often see them, they can be teenagers and younger children, very edgy, very hot-tempered, willing to fly off the handle at the drop of a hat. They tend to be the children in your class that are always ready to fight. And if we remember back to the 3 Fs, that's one of those responses that we know gives us a clue that the child has obviously experienced some type of toxic stress. And they're always prepared to either fight, flee, or freeze, which we know is another method that some children use, where they almost like the rabbit caught in the headlights, where they just freeze on the spot. Because again, if we think back to the Segal's model of the brain, when the thinking part is not working, when you're engaging with the fight, flight and freeze, that upper part of the brain model is not working at all. So you're constantly not going to be able to think about the consequences of your actions, and you can lash out very quickly without thinking about who you're hurting and who's getting hurt in the process. You show the next slide, and this is taken from the Bridgend 2-year pilot project, which we discussed in the very first part of the ACE awareness session. And it starts to look at the intergenerational cycle that some families experience. So when you look at this slide, you start with quite difficult pictures to look at. The young boy in the chair, who is about sort of 6 to 7 years of age, and his father sort of raising his hand, and he's cowering to sort of try and keep himself safe. And then you see the sullen teenagers later on, in a few years on from that, and you start to see sort of an adult, and then the cycle starts to continue, because then that sort of teenager that becomes quite edgy and hot-tempered ends up being the adult that starts to make the same mistakes, and when they have their own families, they start to learn from the behaviours that they've experienced, and that habit is incredibly hard to break. The slide gestures that can heal start to look at what we can do as teachers and people working in a school environment with young people can do to actually help. Because there are some things that can heal. So you're going to play a change in minds now slide at this point, but you're going to talk through, first of all, the 5 gestures that can heal in the box before you show the screening of the couple of minutes long video clip. So we ask you to think about constantly trying to help the children in your class by celebrate, use put-ups, not putting them down. We've got to try and boost their confidence and self-esteem, because they've had lots of negative messages in the home environment. So we have to try and overcome those messages by starting to help them feel a bit better about themselves. And we're really good in schools at celebrating all the small achievements that children make on a day-to-day basis. It's also about being comforting, staying calm and patient even when children are in fight or flight or freeze mode, that you remain calm and patient, and that they feel that you are in control of the situation, even though they might feel that they are out of control, that they feel that the adult is there helping them to feel that they can be comforted when they are in distress. Collaboration is another vital tool for children to have some healing in toxic stress situations, if they feel that they are part of the team. So it's constant group work that we do in the classroom that helps them to feel that their opinion is valued and that they're collaborating with their friends, which also helps them to develop better friendship patterns, because we know that they find it incredibly hard to have relationships. So if they feel that they can collaborate with their friends, whether that's in a setting where you're doing group work or activity tasks, that is of benefit for them as well. Just listening and showing an interest in them and knowing what things that they feel are important to them. One-page profiles that we do in school are incredibly important to help us to get to know the whole child, not just what the child likes to do in the school situation with subjects and English and maths, but actually, well, what that child likes to do outside of school, what makes the school day easier for them. So it's just being an adult that's there for them, to listen to them in times of need. And finally, which we all do a really good job of, is to try and inspire them that they can be anything they want to be with the right support and the level of guidance, and that inspire them to make better choices in their own adult life. Sport plays a huge part in developing resilience in adversity as well, which we need to remember, because in schools we've got that perfect platform to try and find out what their interests are. Is it art? Is it cookery? Is it playing an instrument? Is it they're a good gymnast? Just try and find what that passion is so that you can inspire that child to make some different choices and some different options. The good news about the next slide is that you stress that this cycle, which is incredibly difficult, can be broken. And we now know that there are ways that ACEs can last a lifetime, which we see in a number of adults, sadly, but they don't have to. And we know that you need to stress at this slide is that the positive side to quite a difficult subject that we share in with the staff is that healing can occur. We do know that people that have had many ACEs in their lives go on to lead successful relationships in later on in life. And we look at what makes the difference, and we look at the fact that even though we see people around us all the time with very traumatic events that have happened to them, that they are able to bounce back and they are able to get themselves back on track with the right level of support in place. And the main thing that we can do as a school is to provide the child with those safe, stable, nurturing relationships, and just to be there for them on a day-to-day basis as an adult that's modelling all the ways that we would want them to model themselves when they become an adult. And those relationships really are the crux of everything in this particular slide that you want to be expressing, that children rely on adults to lead the way. They rely on adults to help them to be able to self-regulate their emotions and to help them feel better about themselves. And with those strong positive relationships, we as teachers are in a prime position to be there to help that cycle to be broken. We have the best job ever because we can make children feel better about themselves. We can make children feel that they are worthy, and even if they are living in a negative home environment, that we can try to make a difference when they come to school each day. ACEs can last a lifetime, but they don't have to, which is a positive end to today's sort of session. Healing can occur, we can repair some of those pathways, and we now know that obviously the cycle can only be broken when they start to feel that they have a safe, stable, nurturing relationships, and other protective factors heal, such as I said about the sporting links, the links with the community. So there are ways that obviously that we can do things in school to improve. What happens next? This is where you start to describe the process of becoming an ACE-informed school with your practice and embedding the cultural change and transformation in people's thinking that we want to start the ball rolling with. Today's ACE awareness session is a 3-hour session, which you're almost coming to the completion of. But there are things that happen next. This doesn't just stop at this point. So you want to be stressing that you're going to be now building on what the school's existing skills are already in place. Schools do a tremendous amount of intervention for the most vulnerable pupils. And what we ask schools to complete is something called a readiness tool, which you will be able to find accompanied with the slides, where the school work together to audit existing practice that's already going on in the school to support vulnerable pupils. These can be pupils that are young carers, they could be pupils that have been in the looked after system, they could be pupils that are just underachieving, we could be pupils that have had some experiences of being on the child protection register. But basically you look at the existing practice that already exists in your school to support those pupils. And then you start to look at how you are dealing with trauma and how you are as a school going about helping to build children's resilience. So the ACE awareness is recommended to have been held on an inset training day or half-day session. But you inform the teachers that there is going to be 2 further sessions which continue. The next one is looking at embedding ACE-informed practice and working with trauma and resilience. And the third approach is a PATH approach. The PATH approach stands for Planning Alternative Tomorrows with Hope, and it's a person-centred planning process that the Educational Psychologist Service use to help you to look at where you're from in the starting point and to see where you would like to be in an ideal situation. The reversible writing poem is going to be another YouTube clip that you press on. You don't give any clue of the content of it. You just ask them to follow what's being read out in the YouTube clip. And obviously what it does is it reverses the writing at the end, and then you will have a short discussion with them about how the fact is that we very often make judgments of our young people of where they're going to end up and what's going to happen to them next, and how if we reverse our thinking that we can actually give them some aspirations and give them some opportunities to change their path and give them some food for thought to think about other alternatives that maybe they hadn't thought of before, that they would have chances to make a difference in their lives if they start to have the support that they so often need. You end with a final slide, Something to Nothing, which is by Ian Wright, a famous England footballer. You need to talk first of all, because this slide again is just about 2.5 minutes long, and it actually starts to talk about how Ian Wright had his positive role model and adult relationship with his teacher. And you need to give them a brief introduction to Ian Wright about his life as a child, because Ian Wright had a tremendous high amount of ACEs as a child. His mother was alcoholic. His dad left when he was 18 months old, and there were, I think, 4 children in the family, and the mum went on to marry another gentleman who particularly disliked Ian Wright because he reminded him of her, obviously, ex-husband or ex-partner. And he didn't have a good relationship with his real dad. His dad went off at 18 months, and he did sporadically see him on and off in his life, but he wasn't really there for him. The stepdad was incredibly cruel to him. They were obviously living in quite a deprived area of London. Poverty was a really big issue as well. There wasn't much money for clothes or anything. So you need to give a background first of all that he had obviously a childhood of 4 or more ACEs, and yet you then start to stress of look where he has actually come from and look what he's actually achieved, which gives us the positive impact at the end of the slides to show that with a little bit of help, with a positive adult in your life, that it can make a massive difference and can help you to choose a completely different path. When he meets his teacher, obviously he's so emotional that he can't even speak, that he starts to cry because he thinks his teacher has died. And he wanted his teacher to come and see him play his first game when he had his first cap for England, but he had checked with some of the boys in the local area that he grew up with, and they'd said that he'd passed away, sadly. And the clip goes on to show how obviously the gentleman hadn't passed away, and how he comes and meets him unexpectedly, and he goes on to say that how proud he was of what Ian Wright has made of his life. So we can end this session by saying that a teacher can have that. We've got the invaluable job of really making a difference to the children that we work with. We can be the person that they look back on in later life that has made the difference and changed their lives.